But without further ado, I think one person who I admire and I think I respect absolutely amazingly, Christian Ketels, who's my colleague. In fact, we have worked together for many, many years. He's somebody who was part of the Harvard Business School, worked with Michael Porter at the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness. We actually, it was in 2017 when Mike Porter had a meeting with the Honorable Prime Minister, and that is when we started this whole process of the competitiveness roadmap for India. And Christian was one of the main pillars for really getting this done and getting it off the road and off the block. And I think if I have to really say, if one person I would like to emulate in many, many ways, it is Christian. In fact, I admire him so much that our book on The Elephant Moves is actually dedicated to him and Michael Porter. I couldn't have done it without you, Christian, and I think you have been just such a great support. And thanks a lot for joining in here today. Over to you for your keynote.
Thank you very much. We're already inspired by our haircuts, so that's a good start. It's always fantastic to come here, and this is now becoming a tradition with the second event. Amit, Richard, such a pleasure to be here. It's always great to come to the United States, except once you're in your hotel room and switch on the TV and you look at the news. Such a polarized discussion. Of course, this is not a problem just for the United States. We see it in many of other countries in which we live. I now live in Europe. We also actually see it in India. So this debate about will the giant emerge, what is going to happen with the Indian economy? Nowadays, you often see that there's two different camps. One that says success is inevitable, and if you don't accept that, you're an enemy. The other group says that India is the country of the future. It always was, and it always will be. Tomorrow is always around the corner, but it never really arrives. Now, what I want to do, and I think what we're going to do over the next 2 days, is really to unpeel the onion a little bit and become more specific, granular about where this country is that's so important for the rest of the world. The inspiration of the title of this talk is actually from a new case of Harvard Business School on India. And so I want to talk a little bit after discussing, where is the Indian economy going? Is success really inevitable? I want to discuss a little bit about why what happens in India is so important for the rest of us, what we can learn from the Indian experience. Now let's start with that first question. Is India's success inevitable? We already heard from the General Counsel and from the Ambassador a lot of that positive data that really shows, that India at the moment is on an enormously positive growth streak. Highest growth among all larger economies in the world at the moment, and actually also for the next couple of years. Be the only place where there's not very deep discussions and nervousness about what's ahead, not only short term, but also longer term. If you look at Europe, also if you look at China, and to some degree even at the US, there's a lot of uncertainty about where we're going. But we know, and we've already heard that it's not just about the short-term economic outcomes. What's behind this is really the fundamental economic forces that are shifting in India's favor. The biggest one, and one of the few things that even economists already can look into the future, is demographics. It's one of the things where we actually know quite well on how that situation will look like for the next couple of years. China, the country that really defined the last phase of globalization and global economic growth, has moved beyond its peak in terms of its labor force. It's now facing very fast aging, with all the social issues that we know are associated with that. India is on a very different track. And at some point, aging will happen. But even then, it will be much smoother than what we've seen in China, given their population policies. So this inevitably will drive growth. The question is sort of how much. That has a lot to do with the other factors, what we often call the created business environment in which these individuals will work and thrive and live their lives. And here we've seen a dramatic transformation too in India. Especially with my European friends, I always tell them that, that this memory that you have of India, of non-existent infrastructure, no electricity, of all these other factors, the chaos of India. Yes, there still is some chaos, but there actually has been a massive change in terms of infrastructure. Talked about the space program. We've seen the India stack that was so prominent also during the G20 discussions. India is changing dramatically. One of the things that we've done in the project that Amit talked about on the roadmap for India was actually try to kind of map what are all the policies that have happened over the last couple of years. And you see basically no area that's really relevant for competitiveness that hasn't been touched. So India is on the move. Business environment is changing, the economy is changing, and so we should expect more growth moving forward. However, I would argue that growth and success is not inevitable. It does depend on the hard work and decisions of many of you here in the room that work for the Indian government or Indian companies to overcome some of those barriers that have held the country back in the past. I want to focus especially on three issues: shared prosperity challenge, the jobs challenge, and the implementation challenge. The shared prosperity challenge, and there are lots of dimensions to it: geographically, societal, economic versus social. There is evidence that the GDP growth number in India does not really tell the full story of how living conditions are changing for a large part of the Indian society and large part of those regions. So together with Amit's team in India, we worked on the India Cluster Panorama, which looks at the economic geography of the country and the way that different sectors are allocated in different countries. What we see is that there is really truth to that statement that there are many Indias, not one. There is the high-performance India, which I'm sure many of you call home, that is very connected to the global economy, taking advantage of the changes that we just talked about. But there's a vast part of the country and society that's actually not connected to the global economy and hardly connected to the rest of the country. And we see wages much lower than the average, conditions much worse. That's well known, I think, by the political system. It's important to understand that success is not just about making that top part of Indian society even better. That will be necessary. But what do we do with that 50% of the country that's behind? Job creation. So this is the latest data from the CLAMS database. This is job creation numbers, manufacturing, construction, services. I've left out agriculture, which is another important part, of course, of the Indian economy. We've seen positive job creation numbers also in the last few years. Actually quite interesting to see manufacturing in the last year popping up. But look at that small gray bar there on the top. This is the IMF's projection on what every year number of people entering the Indian labor force over the next decade. So unless we're creating enough jobs, plus improve the quality of the jobs, we're not going to leverage that demographic advantage that we talked about. Just moving with the same pace or doing the same things that we continue to do is not going to be enough. The World Bank has slightly lower numbers, but basically it's the same message. We need to do different things to move forward to leverage the demographic opportunity. Now, why is this so hard? This is so hard because the changes in the business environment that are now required are not things that can just be done in Delhi or by a small group of people in the key ministries, in the Prime Minister's office, in the Ministry of Finance, and so on. Improving the business environment, getting those 50% of the population and regions into the global economy requires changes there, because what they need is location-specific. So you need to change the overall system, involve much more different regions, the states, the urban areas, the private sector in making those type of discussions. And that is what we've seen also in other countries. Economic reform is easier if it's about removing barriers at the macro level. It's much harder if it's about building competitive advantages across the country. So this is what we've worked on and provided some ideas in that study, the roadmap for India. That was published about a year and a half ago, so for those of you who are interested to look at that. The answer then to the question, by the way, is no, the success is not inevitable. It's the opportunity is huge, but it will depend on the choices that Indian policymakers will make. What can others then learn from India? Well, it's really about how does India tackle these type of challenges. This hasn't happened. It's something that's moving, that's occurring today. But that is actually, I think, where we can draw the biggest lessons as others. Why is it important to look at India? Because the challenges that India is facing are really the challenges that are going to define the next state of our global development in terms of economics. How do we deal with inequality? How do we create jobs in a very different environment? How do we grow trade in a much more fractured geopolitical environment? How do we increase affordable energy supply while dealing with climate change? How do we build effective cities, not slums, as the sources of innovation? These issues are pertinent to India, but they are also critical to others. Behind that is actually that it's often not just about the what needs to be done, but how we can get it done. There's so many things that are interconnected, so how can we create the institutions to do it holistically? And how can we support that through our political system? Challenge that many of our countries are facing. So let me pick out some of these issues, because these are the topics that we use sort of India as a way to draw our students in that discussion. How do you achieve growth when the past growth paths of the Asian economies, the Asian tigers and so on, that basically focused on exports in manufacturing, is losing traction? Why is it losing traction? Well, partly it's because about the geopolitical tensions, tariffs, and so on, so it's just harder to do that. But it's also because the economics are changing. General Counsel mentioned AI. Even in manufacturing, we see that even in developing countries, the skill levels have been rising. So manufacturing is no longer that easy entry ticket to get people from the farms into the factories and then help them create a better life. Future growth strategies have to become much more multifaceted. They have to include services, even some local services. So we have to think differently about what enables us to unlock that demographic opportunity. Jobs and social progress. So we have used to kind of think about social progress and economic development as two sort of different parts of what needs to be done. We increasingly see that either we solve them together or we're not going to solve them at all. India has done a lot to try to improve its social policy, much more targeted and so on, and that's great. But ultimately, we know it's about how do you create jobs for people so that they can fend for themselves and are not reliant so much on the support of others. That requires doing a lot of things that traditionally might have been social policy, in healthcare, in providing childcare services that allow women to go into the labor force, in creating public safety that allows women to go and get a job. So these are not separated areas anymore, but we need to start to think about them jointly. It's quite difficult for a political system where there's one minister of health and social services and their logic, and then a minister of economy or finance somewhere else that has a very different logic. We heard about climate change, and that's another topic where I think this convolution of these different areas is really critical. Climate change and the availability of affordable energy is absolutely crucial economically. It's critical how we structure our energy system to deal with climate change. It is also about how we make sure that in a fractured geopolitical system, we're not all depending on China to serve us with solar panels. How do we create sort of their own type of systems? India will have to find an integrated answer to all of these questions. And then it is how you do it. And within our work on the roadmap, we talk quite a bit about how can we improve the way that things are done. In many countries that I've had a chance to work, the smart people like you in the room, know what needs to be done. What they're really struggling with is how to get it done. And so I think we need to focus also in India, what are the right institutional structures within government to create coordination going, given the interaction of issues that I just mentioned, but also, of course, between government and the private sector. Let me conclude with, as an outsider, to talk about how India's success is important for the world. And I want to mention that because I had a discussion in Europe with the European Commission. And their view, also in trade talks with India, is still very much about the, okay, how much do we need to give the Indians so that they give us more access to the market? What I tried to tell them is, for Europe's interest, that's actually a marginal factor. What is important is that India is successful, because India's success has such a crucial influence on some of the key challenges that the world, and therefore also Europe, is facing, especially on climate, but also on growth. So in growth, we talked about the short-term implications and where are there new opportunities for our companies. But it's even starker if you look at the long-term projections. And this is data from the OECD, so they are not necessarily over-optimistic on India. And it's a scenario, it's not the prognosis per se. But what you see here, this is the group of OECD and G20 countries. Much higher growth and a massive improvement in the share of total GDP in that group that's going to be in India. And in fact, India pretty much takes all the losses of China, the US, and Europe over those coming decades. So if we are looking for growth, it has to come from India, and companies need to deal with that. Climate change and energy. So yes, India is doing a lot. But look at this. India will see the largest increase in energy demand of any country in the years ahead. India's increase in CO2 emissions is going to be the largest of any country in those years to come, despite a very low CO2 per GDP and per capita numbers. And India is going to be one of the critical markets for renewable energy manufacturing, or the products and services, because this is going to be where the market is. So the choices that you are making, these choices are going to have enormous implications for the rest of the world. So this is why I hope this type of analysis, the work that we've done on the roadmap, is helpful to Indian decision makers to think about their future. This is why I, as an outsider looking at India, am so excited to see what's going on. And I'm looking forward to the day today and to the day to tomorrow to learn more in our discussions. Thank you.